Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the Kevin Michael Grace Show. A word of explanation. This is my first show of the week. And the reason for that is that I had to move, and then my moving plans were disrupted and kind of fell through. They're back on now. I have another temporary residence. I don't know how long I'm going to be here, but I will put on the show whenever I can. I see, according to Twitter, heated protests continue in U.S. cities over George Floyd's death. They're heated protests. Of course, they're not riots. And the latest that I see is that the riots have shifted, or at least maybe they're going on in the same place. St. Paul, one of the Twin Cities, just south of Minneapolis, is on fire. Let's see what the St. Paul Police Department has to say from 3 hours ago. We are working to disperse large groups of people causing property damage along University Avenue. Please avoid the area if possible. Officials are giving dispersal orders to groups gathered in various areas of the city, damaging property and attempting to steal from businesses. Let's see. Officers are having rocks, liquor bottles, and bricks thrown at them in the area of the Target on University Avenue. We are working peacefully to get the crowd to disperse. Squad cars have been damaged by rocks, bricks, bottles, and other items being thrown at officers. More dispersal orders being given by officers. Let's see. They retweeted something from Melvin Carter, who is the mayor of St. Paul, a black man. He tweeted, "Please stay home. Please do not come here to protest. Please keep the focus on George Floyd, on advancing our movement, and on preventing this from ever happening again. We can all be in that fight together." From 1 hour ago, a fire has been reported at TJ Maxx on the 1400 block of University Avenue. Officers continue to be hit with rocks and bottles thrown by people who are also breaking into buildings, looting, and destroying property. Please stay away from the Midway area near Target on University Avenue. We continue to work to disperse the crowds, protect people, and protect property. However, our officers continue to be assaulted, and the area is not safe. Mayor Melvin Carter, this is 16 minutes ago, Mayor Melvin Carter and Chief Todd Axtell just spoke to the media, where they announced that support from the National Guard has been requested. Now, it's somewhat amusing that after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, St. Paul was feeling very smug, especially the police department. We are so much better than that here in St. Paul. And so I guess they didn't think there would be any riots because, look, there's a proximate cause for these riots, and that is the death of George Floyd, which may or may not be a manslaughter or second-degree murder. But one of the things that the media doesn't seem to understand about this and similar incidents is people riot because it is fun. It's exhilarating. Plus, you get free big-screen TVs and all the liquor you can carry. What we're hearing in the wake of this killing is that apparently white people in the United States, well, there's a white intifada that white people seize upon any excuse or none to kill black people. Apparently this happens thousands, tens of thousands of years, and policemen in the United States have apparently declared war on black people, even though two of the officers involved in the death of George Floyd were not white. And we see this again and again, that officers involved in these struggles with people under arrest, which end up with death. Oh, it's white cops doing it. Well, there's an awful lot of black cops in the United States, and of course in places like Baltimore and Detroit, they're majority black. But behind this Intifada idea is the idea of systemic or systematic racism. that, excuse me, that black people or people of color generally cannot expect justice in the United States because of this systematic racism. And I've mentioned several times on this program that there has been a push in recent years to segregate people of color, particularly blacks, from the police, from the justice system. Essentially, blacks should be left to their own devices. Any arrest is suspicious on its face. That is to say, any arrest of a black person is suspicious because all white people, and apparently a lot of black people, cops, prosecutors, judges, are in fact motivated by systemic racism, even if they don't understand it. That this is America's original sin. And the sad thing is, apparently, is that there's nothing that can be done about it. That white people are going to be guilty of this until the end of time. And all they can do is to seek to make amends. Endless reparations, endless special privileges, but it's never enough. And it will never end. And white people should be grateful that the entire country is not burned down, apparently. George Floyd, according to the Mail, was arrested for trying to pay store with counterfeit bill before white cop knelt on his neck until he died. As Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey, I don't know whether it's pronounced Frey or Frey, but it's a German name, so I'll pronounce it in the German fashion. Minneapolis Mayor says he'd still be alive if he were white. This fellow Frey is an idiot because he can be held largely responsible for the riots in Minneapolis and St. Paul, because he's the mayor of the city, and essentially he said that we're protecting a white murderer, a white man with a badge, or several, who killed a black man. And yes, it is systemic racism, according to the mayor. Apparently, the mayor was near tears as he spoke. Quote, "I'm not a prosecutor, but let me be clear. The arresting officer killed someone," he told CBS. "He'd be alive today if he were white. The facts that I've seen, which are minimal, certainly lead me down the path that race was involved." Well, if the facts that you've seen are minimal, it would behoove you, Mayor, to shut up. Now, I don't know whether this is an error on behalf of the Mail or of the mayor. He said that the arresting officer killed someone. There's no question of that, but killing someone is not the same as murder, certainly not under the law. So the Mail has a handy graphic showing just which parts of Minneapolis were laid waste to. The Target, whoa, I guess the Target is the unsafest place in any American city. The Target was just looted and destroyed. Minneapolis Police 3rd Precinct was attacked. Minnehaha Lake Wine and Spirits was torched and looted. The AutoZone was torched. Wendy's was torched. And some distance away, some blocks away, Cadillac Pawn and Jewelry. I thought I'd look up this Mayor Frey fellow, and as I suspected, he is not from Minnesota or even he's not from Minneapolis or even from Minnesota. According to Wikipedia, he grew up in Oakton, Virginia, a Washington, D.C. suburb, and received a track scholarship to attend the College of William and Mary, from which he graduated in 2004. He is 19, he's 38 years old, rather young man. After graduating with a degree in government, he received a contract from a shoe company to run professionally and competed for Team USA in the Pan American Games. And he earned a JD degree from Villanova University, which is in Pennsylvania. Now, he moved to Minneapolis in 2009. So he's only been in the city for 11 years. He was first elected to Minneapolis City Council 4 years after he arrived in Minneapolis. And so, in other words, he knew very little about the place. But I've noticed with politicians, both in my country and in the United States, that increasingly As Newt Gingrich famously or infamously said about himself, he was asked where he was from, and he said, nowhere. Obviously, a lot of these people, they look for a city which they think is going to provide maximum value in terms of them being elected. Tim Kaine, who was the vice presidential choice for Hillary Clinton, he moved to Richmond, Virginia, clearly for that reason. And of course, what you see with so many of these other carpetbaggers is that they leave places that have been wrecked by the very policies that they intend to bring to their new homes. For instance, a couple of well-known examples, that New Hampshire has been invaded by refugees from Massachusetts, thus, turning it into a democratic state. It's becoming very liberal indeed. And of course, Vermont was wrecked by people from the state of New York, Bernie Sanders being a prime example. So I'm looking at the picture of the mayor, and I guess because of the very strict lockdown rules in Minnesota, which to its credit, the Catholic Church rebelled against. This fellow hasn't had a haircut in several months, and he very much resembles Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada. I'm wondering whether this is deliberate. Apparently, the lockdown prevents him from buying a razor, either manual or electric, because he's got that hipster, I haven't shaved for 3 or 4 days look. Oh, yes, I noticed on Twitter last night that a great many people in the Minneapolis area, particularly those who were, fight the power, no justice, no peace, they're not too keen on the world looking at Minnesota right now. Someone named Ian Coldwater tweeted, "If you don't live here, I promise you your takes aren't as hot as my city burning down right now, and I don't want to hear them." My response was, so now you don't want publicity. You lot were singing a different tune when the killing of George Floyd led every newscast in the English-speaking world. This Ian Coldwater fellow, there's a children's cartoon character as his avatar, some woman, I don't want to jump to conclusions, or girl with blue hair. And he describes himself, strangely, as a former teen mom with the slogan, "Stay punk." Black Lives Matter, and I'm going to be very loud about that right now, and not at all sorry, and you should be loud about it too. It's just a protest, Things get out of hand, or is it like what happened in Ferguson or Baltimore in 2016, where the authorities decided that these people got some steam, got to let off some steam. And so fireballs will appear over the city for several days. But I mean, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? Now, one of the myths in all these cases is somehow that it's only black people who are killed by cops. There are more white people killed by cops in the United States than black people. Although, to be fair, black people are disproportionately killed by cops. Black people are also disproportionately involved in, I'll just leave it there. You can finish the sentence for me. Okay. Oh, the Reverend Al Sharpton has got involved. And we're listening to Al Sharpton because, once again, a reminder, because it's important, that Al Sharpton is responsible not only for the Tawana Brawley hoax, but for inciting 2 honest-to-God pogroms in New York City. People got killed as a result. We must restore peace. This is the message. With tears in his eyes, Mayor Jacob Frey spoke to reporters late Thursday morning, announcing that there'll be an all-out effort to restore peace and security in the coming days. Police Chief Madaria Arredondo said that faith and community leaders will be on the streets to help keep the peace as more demonstrations are planned for Thursday night. You can't restore the peace without order, and the police have been sitting on their hands. In Minneapolis, I guess they don't want to get involved, and probably for good reason. It's very dangerous in the United States now to have any kind of interaction with Black people if you are a police officer. Darren Brown, who was Darren Wilson, I think his name was, the police officer in Ferguson, who was attacked by gentle giant Michael Brown. He was assaulted, punched. Brown tried to take his revolver or a service piece. I think it took about 9 rounds to take him down. He was charging at the officer when he was shot to death. He was exonerated. An exhaustive investigation proved that claims made about his conduct were lies. They were straight up lies, and he was exonerated. Guess what? He was fired. None the less. Oh, let's get into some clown world here. In a stirring moment at the noontime news conference, Minneapolis City Council Vice President Andrea Jenkins sang Amazing Grace, expressing condolences to Floyd's relatives, a Black transgender woman. Jenkins said that the Black community in Minneapolis has long felt like it's had a knee pressing on its collective neck, a knee that says Black lives don't matter. There is no white intifada in the United States. There is, in fact, a Black intifada, and the Black intifada, it goes back to 1967 at the latest. That's when much of Detroit was burned to the ground, and there were major riots in dozens of other major cities, precipitating the white flight of the 60s and 70s, which somehow ended up on white people themselves. They decided that the places where they lived, where they had communities, where they had been for generations, they were simply too unsafe, and the schools had become war zones. So they fled. Perhaps they shouldn't have fled. Perhaps they should have fought for their communities, but given that no one was on their side, and going back to Lyndon Johnson in 1968, and the Carter Commission, the federal government of the United States has been keen to find any excuse to blame white people for their misfortunes in the cities, and frankly, to punish them. Let's have a look at the chat here. There's a different lighting combination here again. There's a light overhead, and there's light coming in, natural sunlight coming in from behind. I don't know, perhaps this is the most realistic I've ever looked. I don't know whether that's necessarily an advantage. Okay, Ultra Testosterone is back with his one-word comments. Trump slide 2020, says Don from Beyond. Well, famously, in 1968, the rioting did not help the Democratic Party at all. That Americans wanted a law and order president, and they got one in Richard Nixon. George Wallace nearly spoiled the race for Nixon. Wallace took something like, 5, 6 states. He got over 10% of the vote. And in 2016, the riots in Baltimore and Ferguson did not help Hillary Clinton. Like the new digs, Kevin says, Moon Man, well, don't get used to them because I'm not going to be here. Don't forget to put the do not disturb sign on the door. Well, that's not necessary for the reason, VDR, that the hotels in Victoria are not cleaning the rooms. They're not doing maid service because of the COVID-19 panic. They will give you fresh towels and fresh shampoo and soap and the like, but no, they are not servicing the rooms. Phlegmatica says this is Minneapolis's 1967 Detroit moment. White flight will only accelerate. No, I think that it has to. And you see a curious dichotomy in how these types of events affect white people and black people, black people seem to use them as confirmation events. Now, obviously, there are many, many thousands of interactions between black people and the police in the United States every year. A few end in death. But every time this happens, every time a black man dies at the hands of the police, that it is proof that the KKK is back and there's going to be a purge. You see this again, and I'll get to that shortly, amongst the progressives, the SJWs, the woke people. They are fully invested in this idea as well. The majority of white people, it's my belief that every time this happens, they become more fed up with it. Not necessarily that they would say this in public, because it is very dangerous to say such things in public. But there's a lot of soft liberals out there, and events such as we've seen in Minneapolis and St. Paul. A lot of these soft liberals, they're not liberals anymore. Yes, Eternal Fisherman says, and if black officers do it to blacks, then it's due to internalized racism. Yes, of course. David Wright says, make sure to slam the breakfast bar tomorrow if they exist anymore. No, they do not. I should mention, to getting away from the topic, that in the previous place that I was staying, which is a larger establishment than this one, the restaurants actually opened last week. And I'd sort of forgotten what a restaurant was and how you could go and sit down in them and people would bring you food. So I actually went to the hotel restaurant last Friday night. I don't make a habit of this, but as I say, it was sort of a celebration of a return to sanity. Philip Daniel says, anyone remember how white people looted in response to the killing of unarmed Justine Damond by Minneapolis cop Mohammed Noor in 2017? Well, I'm just going to get to that in just a minute. Eternal Fisherman says Frey can be both, but he's of Jewish origin. Yes, that is true. Not that it's particularly relevant. YT says the cops are getting crucified in Minnesota. The videos are horrific. Many good, honest men among them. I can only hope they have supportive families to come back home to. Expect to see more cop suicides. Yes, this videoing everything, it really cuts both ways. When you have the police seemingly acting as disproportionate force, as they did with George Floyd, well, you get all those videos. You know, when you look back at, say, the burning of Detroit in 1967, you got some still pics. You know, maybe some cameras would have some stuff for the evening news, but it's not in real time as we have it now. And there are not hundreds or thousands of such videos. And what the videos show you is, you know, who are the people who are committing this violence and how much they are enjoying it. And again, I said previously, I really have a problem with people who don't understand why this kind of behavior is indulged in, because it is fun. It is exhilarating. Visionary Companion says in the late 80s, Minneapolis is seen as one of the centers of alternative rock, which was largely white groundswell of independent music. There was Prince as well, and his whole scene there in Minneapolis. Okay, let's talk about that cop, the one who killed the Australian. It's a sad story. There's a picture. This is from VDare by James Fulford. And there's a picture. It's from Facebook. And it says, community leader, Officer Noor Center, met with Minneapolis Mayor Betsy Hodges, not pictured, in 2016, where she praised him for joining the police force. And there are 3 women wearing a very heavy Islamic covering. A white Australian woman, Justine Damond, was shot by a Somali police officer, Mohammed Noor, on the Minneapolis Police Department, not in self-defense, but apparently for no reason, i.e. carelessness or incompetence of some kind. The cop with only 2 years experience who shot the pajama-wearing Minneapolis woman, 40, dead through the door of his squad car while his body cam was off after she called 911 over a home intruder. Fulford comments, this seems to be the kind of reckless incompetence you would expect if you put a Somali in police uniform and give him a gun. We know that Minnesota has Somalis because of refugee resettlement, but why does it have Somali police officers? Well, one could have asked the same question in Canada. We know that Canada has Somalis because of refugee resettlement or simply illegal immigration. But one of these fellows was made immigration minister of Canada by Justin Trudeau in 2016. And he cheerfully admitted to the New York Times that he was indeed an illegal immigrant to my country. This Officer Noor, he was a screw-up. He was a screw-up right from the very beginning. But steps were taken, great steps were taken to keep him on the force because he had been marked out as a Black and as a Somali immigrant refugee success story. And his gross incompetence was not going to stop the Minneapolis police from making a hero until he shot dead a woman in apparent panic. I have here from American Renaissance a flyover, if you will, of the neighborhood in where this destruction happened last night. This is from Gilbert Kavanaugh. Last night in Minneapolis, there was an eruption of violence, destruction, and looting, largely in around the ghetto part of Lake Street, one of the city's main thoroughfares. I lived near Lake Street. None of this is surprising. The area is a mix of mostly Somalis, Blacks, and Hispanics, with some American Indians and whites as well, and it is exactly what you would expect it to be. Midtown Phillips, as it's called, just Midtown to locals, is very dangerous. So per 100,000 residents, violent crime in the USA, 381. In Minnesota, 220. In Minneapolis, 793, which is kind of shocking that the violent crime rate in Minneapolis is twice as high as it is in the United States generally. And in Midtown, it is 2,554, which is close to 7 times higher than the average rate of violent crime in the United States of America, and more than 3 times higher than in Minneapolis itself. Property crime, similar. Total crime, similar. Midtown Phillips crime rates are 206% higher than the national average. Violent crimes in Midtown Phillips are 571% higher than the national average. In Midtown Phillips, you have a 1 in 13 chance of becoming a victim of crime. Now, that is a shocking statistic because that's clearly a neighborhood that anyone with any money or any sense got out of, because it's not a place where a sane man or woman would want to live. Like many American ghettos, Midtown has many anti-violence murals that seem like ironic jokes. Stop the violence, stop violence. Yeah, I noticed this some years ago, and I'll pass on this wisdom to you. A mural, with very few exceptions, a mural in a city is a signifier. And what it signifies is you do not want to live here. All the stores advertise in several languages that they accept welfare. And so we have it in Spanish, and we have it in, I assume that's Somali. An office for WIC is conveniently located on Lake Street. There's just another mural, more murals, just grotesque artwork. Last night, the rioters appear to have attacked the public library. And Scott Greer, always amusing, tweeted, "Laugh my ass off at the white leftist crying." There's a video attached. Not the library. People read books there. And I could make a reference to a well-known Chris Rock routine, but I'm not going to do that. I'm sure many of you have seen it. It may be the worst library in the country. A now deleted Yelp review described it well. Every time I come to this library, I see junkies using the public restroom as a shooting gallery. Maybe that's why this library has actual security personnel. We used to bring our kids here because it's the closest library open on Sunday. After last time, having to explain what a junkie is to a 4-year-old, we'll skip the hepatitis and go somewhere else. Maybe this library location will be better in warmer weather when IV drug users can pass out in a park instead of a restroom. Yeah. The media doesn't like to tell you much about places like Midtown in Minneapolis because it's too horrible. It's simply too horrible. There's two kinds of stories that you get. There's the story of racism, but then there's the story of hope. You know, the community gathering together to fight violence, particularly gun violence, and the community is doing no such thing. Because as Jill Levy wrote in Ghetto Side, everybody know who the shooters are. Everybody know who the murderers are. And most of the people in neighborhoods like this are closely related to murderers. Many people still think of Minnesota as a kind of a land of Scandinavian dairy farmers, but that has not been true for a long time. Especially as a mix. According to the 2010 census, it was 63.8% white, 18.6% black, 2.2% American Indian, 5.6% Asian, which includes the Hmong people, Hispanic 10.5%. Then he goes into crime statistics by race, and you can go to American Renaissance if you want that. I don't want to get kicked off YouTube. So I'll leave it up to you. You know, the more you know, as they say. Now, Ice Cube, he was one of the 3 members of NWA, straight out of Compton. I'm not going to say what NWA means because it's a word that certain people say or hear 50, 100, 150 times a day. But if someone like me is to say it, could be the end of the world. In the wake of, this is from Breitbart, in the wake of George Floyd's death in Minneapolis, veteran rapper and actor Ice Cube asked how much more crime must police officers commit against Black Americans before we strike back. I recall a man in Dallas, what was that, 4 years ago? He shot 5 police officers to death. That's a striking back, isn't it? How long will we go for blue on black crime before we strike back? Ice Cube, whose real name is O'Shea Jackson. Disney decided to make him a family-friendly movie star a few years ago, but apparently it has not moderated his rage. There's another story about Ice Cube, again from Breitbart. Hollywood actor and rapper Ice Cube shared with his 4.9 million Twitter followers a photo that falsely links former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin and felon Jonathan Riches wearing a Make Whites Great Again hat. Ice Cube's tweet with the image has been retweeted more than 24,000 times, despite the fact that it's in violation of the same misinformation guidelines that the Silicon Valley company is currently using to punish conservatives on the platform. The police officer in question looks to be at least, 10 or 15 years older than the man wearing the Make Whites Great Again baseball cap. But I'll tell you a funny story. This is a true story. That after the shootout, the Symbionese Liberation shootout in Los Angeles, and I believe 1974, the members of the Symbionese Liberation Army had moved to a black neighborhood in Los Angeles. The cops fired, hundreds of rounds, maybe thousands of rounds into this house, also gas. And they wanted to know, who was dead. They were known members and associates of the SLA. So a neighbor, a black woman, she was brought in. And this woman, did you see this woman? in this house, in this neighborhood? A white woman. Did you see this woman? And she got asked a couple of times, and then she said she didn't want to do this anymore because she said, quote, all white women look the same to me. Maybe the same thing with Ice Cube. Maxine Waters, the perennial congresswoman, this is from the U.S. Sun, Maxine Waters has shockingly blamed President Donald Trump for cops killing black people days after George Floyd died in police custody. Waters, a Democrat from California who frequently launches wild attacks at Trump, told TMZ she thinks the Minneapolis officer Derek Chauvin, who was filmed with his neck on Floyd's knee, enjoyed doing it. Those last three words are a direct quotation. Trump on Wednesday called the death very strange and tragic. After his death, Waters said, my first thought was, not again, not one more killing. I'm reflecting on all the killings of young black men in particular, but of course, black women too, at the hands of the police and at the hands of these white supremacists. How many black women are killed by American police every year? I would think it would be a very small number. But I guess it comes down to a question of motive. That when black men kill other black men, and it is typically for very stupid reasons or no reason, that's not so sad, we're supposed to believe. Of course, if a white police officer does it, then it's the end of the world. I mean, I sound sarcastic there, but that appears to be the actual situation on the ground. Some years ago on my old podcast with Kevin Steele, we talked about Joe Levy's book, Ghetto Side, which is set in Los Angeles, and it is a real eye-opener. And I came to the conclusion after reading the book that if these people have no interest in making their communities better, why should I care? They all know who the shooters are. They all know who the murderers are. And they not only keep silent, but they protect them. And all of this carrying on and wailing about gun deaths, particularly the accidental death of children through misfires and ricochets, it just, after reading that book, it just seemed to me to be crocodile tears. Oh, I was mentioning the woke people before. Well, here's a woke person, Frances Fisher. She's an actress. I guess she's also known for being Clint Eastwood's girlfriend for some years. From Breitbart, Hollywood actress Frances Fisher posted an inflammatory tweet this week calling for a, quote, race war, unquote, in apparent response to the death of George Floyd. Here's the exact tweet. They want a race war. We'll give them a race war. I'm with Black Lives Matter. We will win. It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love each other and support each other. We have nothing to lose but our change. And this is attributed not to Marx, but to someone called Assata Shakur, who is described as a member of the Black Liberation Army who murdered New Jersey State Trooper Werner Forster in 1973. She deleted the tweet. She also said it's white supremacy acting out, encouraged by the Trump administration. Now, Frances Fisher should look in a mirror, and I'm going to recycle, again, that joke from the movie Go, with regard to Frances Fisher. If she were any more white, she'd be clear. And she's not going to do very well in a race war. No. And if I gave Frances Fisher truth serum, sodium pentothal, or some such, and asked her about various parts of the city that she lives in, and there are certain neighborhoods that you don't go to, that you never go to, and why is that? Well, unless this woman is very foolish in her personal life, she is going to exercise self-preservation. Not very many people in the United States are as wealthy as Frances Fisher, And a lot of white people, sadly, have to live in disgusting neighborhoods. That it's not just the crime, I suppose, it's just the constant anxiety and hostility. But I'm sure when the revolution comes, when the race war comes, that Ice Cube and his ilk will be very pleased to have the support of Francis Fisher. As they're saying with regard to COVID-19, we're all in this together. Mike Cernovich appears to have lost his mind. This is what he tweeted yesterday. Antifa, a largely white group made up of members of the media, is framing Black Lives Matter for these riots. Folks, I have followed this scene for years, and this isn't the authentic BLM in action. This is Antifa framing Black folks for their crimes. Wow. That wow is from him, not from me. I guess that for some, it's like COVID-19. Most people get COVID-19 and they're asymptomatic or have very mild symptoms. And to others, well, the disease is traumatic or even deadly. And I guess DR3, Dems are the real racists. It's an incurable disease for some people, for some conservatives. Yeah, why don't you tell us again how Minneapolis and St. Paul and Hennepin County, I believe it's called, and the state of Minnesota themselves have Democratic administrations. Yeah, that's the reason why these places are so terrible, because it's the Dems that did it. It's just too funny. Joe Biden, of course, is still reeling from an interview he gave to Charlemagne the God, in which he said that if you don't vote for me, if you're black and you don't vote for me, you ain't black. And then he decided that he was going to blame the black radio host for this, which I don't think was a very smart move. But again, according to Breitbart, former Vice President Joe Biden is backtracking on the idea that his eventual running mate will be a woman of color. Quote, "Look, I'm not going to get into that right now because we haven't gotten there yet," he said. "There are women of color under consideration, and there are women from every part of the country under consideration. There's a lot of really qualified women," does he have binders full of them, "that are ready to be president, but I'm not making that commitment." Maybe he had this flash in his mind. Stacey Abrams, no. We can't do that now. I just wonder, other women of color. There's Kamala Harris, who a surfer mommy destroyed in the Democratic debates, pointing out that Senator Harris had a habit when in charge of keeping prisoners, black prisoners mostly, in work farms so the state could make money off them. And it would seem that, well, Kamala Harris is, her father's Jamaican and her mother is a Tamil. Neither of her parents are American. Kamala Harris appears to be an anchor baby. She has no black American slave black blood in her, and I don't think that blacks like Senator Harris very much. Who does that leave? Elizabeth Warren. Well, she once claimed to be a person of color, but of course, she is a nagging shrew, and the Bernie bros hate her. Governor Karen from Michigan. No, I think she's blotted her copybook. There's a Senator, what's her name? Clobgoblin or Clonopin or whatever. She seems to be fairly anonymous, but again, the last two are not women of color. I suppose Biden could pick someone that no one has heard of, but the only reason that anyone's heard of Stacey Abrams is because the media decided in 2018 that she was going to become the governor of Georgia, despite the fact that she has none of the qualifications to be a successful politician. I wanted to talk a little bit about history repeating itself. Back in 2016, I was thinking that that year could turn out to be a lot like 1968. 68, you had race riots, you had horrific riots at the Democratic Convention, you had a real racial sundering of the American people, you had the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, you had student riots all over the world. You had Charles de Gaulle, the president of France, pretty much chased out of office. Lyndon Johnson was chased out of office by the failure of his Vietnam War policy. So I was thinking there were a lot of comparisons. But I was thinking about 1956. There's a lot going on in the world today. We've got the race riots in America. But let's see, we have China taking over Hong Kong. We have China invading India. We have China in a trade war with the United States and Australia, and among other countries. China making all of these threats. You have Trump declaring war on social media. You have the failure of a coup attempt against the president of the United States by the deep state. So let's see some of the things that happened in 1956. Nasser, president of Egypt, vowing to reconquer Palestine. British spies Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean showed up in the Soviet Union after being gone for 5 years. The 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was held, and then some months later, we discovered that Khrushchev had consolidated power, he had humbled his rivals, and he had delivered the sensational so-called secret speech in which he denounced Stalin and the cult of Stalin. And it truly was a secret speech for many months. There were rumors about it, but and I learned this from reading Tim Weiner's book, Legacy of Ashes. It was James Jesus Angleton who delivered the secret speech to the CIA, where he was head of counterintelligence, and he got it from Israeli intelligence, with which he was very close indeed. You have a whole bunch of countries, getting their independence, Morocco being one. The British deported Archbishop Makarios from Cyprus, which later led to a civil war on that island. You have the suppression of uprisings against the Soviet Union in Georgia and in Poland and in Hungary, which led to the anti-communists taking over Hungary. And there was a Soviet invasion, very bloody invasion. And again, I learned from Tim Weiner's book that despite the lies that the CIA and the American government told for decades, it turns out that Radio Free Europe was broadcasting call to arms to the Hungarian people and telling them that the Americans would support them. Well, the Hungarians rose up and they were slaughtered, and the Americans did nothing. And we have, let's see, what else we got here? I wrote down a bunch of examples here. Oh, we had a flu. We had a pandemic, the Asian flu, which supposedly originated in 1956, and it killed 1 million people worldwide. Fidel Castro landed in Cuba from Mexico. Khrushchev, despite his break with Stalin, this is the year that he uttered his infamous "We will bury you" taunt. Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. And incredibly, the governments of Britain, France and Israel formed an alliance to take it by force, which they did. But President of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower, did not take kindly to this, and he essentially bullied them into leaving, to surrendering their gains, which led to the end of Anthony Eden's career. He was prime minister, and it led from that point of France having a very deep suspicion of the foreign policy of the United States. Oh, and the Montgomery bus boycott began and ended in 1956 when the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that the laws, the segregation laws of the type in Montgomery, Alabama, were illegal. So it was a very eventful year, one in which there was a considerable fear of, well, World War III. And given some of the things that are going on in the world right now, it's not unfathomable that there should be people who are afraid of an imminent World War III. James Mitchell, yes, he makes fun of Joe Biden. If you don't vote for me, you're not a jogger. Yes, it became a meme to Photoshop all of these white people jogging through unfinished houses because, of course, that's what white people do. Again, this conservatism. Oh no, I violate private property. I trespass on private property all the time. That's a very dangerous thing to do in the United States of America. Very dangerous indeed, and it's simply not true. Simply not true. Prince was a vulgarian. I don't know. He made a lot of very catchy music. When that album Around the World in a Day came out, was that 1985? With that song Raspberry Beret? I mean, he was the king of pop music, and then he decided that he didn't want to be the king of pop music. A remarkably talented man he was. Kevin, you look like you've gotten some sun. It may be that simply because the lighting is more natural here, that my natural, I looked like a ghost in previous live streams, but I suppose this is more my natural color. It has been very sunny in Victoria for most of several weeks. Okay. Someone complaining about our moderator, Chad Chadson. He is essential, indeed. Let's see. Delacroix says we even have a new space BS. I see that Steve Carroll has a show. It's called, what's it called? Space Force or Space Police? Something like that. And it's show run by Greg Daniels, who, of course, King of the Hill and The Office, Parks and Recreation. People had high hopes for it. But the early reviews are in, and everybody hates it. Everybody hates it. Oh, I should mention again with the Lester Pearson, the KGB agent who became Prime Minister of Canada in 1962 or 1963. He won a Nobel Peace Prize for stabbing Britain in the back over the Suez invasion. I suppose there are still very strong feelings about that in Britain on both sides, but that generation is almost completely died out. Yeah, the sound is good because, again, this is a live room, just like the hotel room I was in previous, both live rooms, whereas that bedroom I was in for the first few months is a very dead room. Okay, so let's move on to another subject. Boris Johnson on the brink. I saw recently that his popularity was in the negative figures. I don't know how that's actually possible, but that's what I saw reported. The last straw, perhaps, for Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, is that his chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, was found to have possibly broken his own government's lockdown rules. He drove from London something like 260 miles to, I believe, Durham in northern England because his child and wife got sick, and he was worried about who was going to look after his child, so his child was deposited with grandparents, and so Dominic Cummings became the wickedest man in Britain. It doesn't help that he looks like a thug. This does not help at all. I'm looking at, he's surrounded by two policemen in this picture from the Daily Mail, and I swear one of these policemen, she's a woman, and what is she, 4'10"? It's just absolutely ridiculous. And she also appears to be very much overweight, but it could be just all of the stuff that she's got in her vest. So a bone has been thrown to the enemies of Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson, but these sort of half measures, I don't think they ever work. Dominic Cummings is considering quitting as Boris Johnson's senior advisor later this year, well-placed sources said yesterday. According to an insider who knows him well, he intends to step back from the political front line now that the UK is finally cutting ties with the EU. The suggestion that he could be out in 6 months was reinforced by a separate claim that he will consider himself largely redundant by Christmas if he completes his shakeup of Whitehall mandarins since then. The report appeared in the Spectator magazine, where Cummings used to work and where his wife, Mary Wakefield, is a commissioning editor. You see, the problem with these half measures is, so he's not going to have to be dynamited out of there. He's not going to have to be, taken out in a body bag. Well, if he's willing to leave in 6 months, why isn't he willing to leave in 6 days or 6 hours for that matter? A very strong piece by Simon Heffer, who, of course, is the author of the outstanding biography of Enoch Powell, Like the Roman. It's in the Critic Co-UK, and it's called Boris's Corona Catastrophe, an indolent, blustering prime minister surrounded by supine, vacuous incompetence. And again, I'll mention that Boris would do well to put on a business suit, as Trump does, and as Justin Trudeau does. He's been photographed wearing ill-fitting jumpers and shorts. And given that he's 40, 50, 60 pounds overweight, and he is, he's just swollen. His face is all swollen and blotchy. He just looks terrible. He does not look fit for purpose. But Simon Heffer writes, no government would choose to deal with the coronavirus pandemic, a political death trap that would have presented an immense challenge to any administration in history. By February, some scientists to whom the government chose to listen were suggesting the disease threatened to kill on a scale unseen in the developed world since the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918. Until then, however, this government has to deal with a people of whom some have become risk-averse to the extent where they see death as an outrage rather than as an inevitable feature of life. Nor, as in 1918, was there a political consensus underpinning a coalition government against a common enemy whose destructive potential was far worse than any disease. In 1918, there was no question of what we now call a lockdown. The decision to carry on as normal was dictated to the government by the necessity of yet greater events. With almost all factories devoted to war production, it was impossible to close them. With thousands of military and medical personnel going to and from the continent each day, they could be confined only at the cost of losing the war. In 2020, no such considerations pertained. When a nervous population saw other countries closing down, it expected its leaders to do the same. Their elected leaders did not have the courage to resist this desire. However, the fact that preventative measures seemed technically and to some economically possible created an even greater difficulty than the virus itself. It led to what was effectively an arms race between Western governments as defenses went up against the pandemic. One developed country locked down after another, except for Sweden. One polity after another put the productive sectors of its economy into a deep freeze and increased public spending spectacularly to try to protect the jobs and livelihoods of those affected. It would have taken a brave government, as Sweden's was, to have stood out against this tide. There was little chance the British government would have the intellectual self-confidence to do so, and no chance at all that it could draw on a deep reservoir of statesmanship to make such a decision. Boris Johnson had a classical education. He went to Eton and Oxford. He did not get a first in Oxford. Apparently, he was put out about that. He is fond of peppering his speech with Greek and Latin quotations, but he's really never given the impression, and I followed his career for decades, that he is a man that's much given to thinking, or that he had any idea what he would want to do with Britain should he ever become prime minister. Now, Brexit was an opportunity for him to distinguish himself from, well, the disastrous premiership of Theresa May, and it sufficed to vault him into office. But from the very beginning, he's played the role of a wastrel who is constantly being found out, and he gives a coy look to the audience, an expression that says, "I'm a bad widow boy," and oh, you just can't stay angry at Boris Johnson. Well, people are certainly angry with him now, very angry indeed. Simon Heffer writes, "The Prime Minister is an indolent man for whom the exercise of power is a recreation or an indulgence rather than a duty. His ministers, with few exceptions, lack the wit and the experience to exercise judgment and common sense satisfactorily. We have a political class for whom ambition outweighs a sense of public service in almost every case, and this has made dealing with this already highly taxing problem nearly impossible." In April, as the Prime Minister convalesced at Chequers, the Sunday Times outlined what it called 38 days of inaction from the moment when the gravity of the impending pandemic became clear to ministers until ministers actually did anything concrete about it. At every step, there was a failure to take clear decisions. The choice was either to implement lockdown or to behave like Sweden. The second option was popular among a substantial minority of Johnson's own MPs, for whom the long-term economic consequences of crashing the gross domestic product were too awesome to contemplate. Setting a template that would be followed throughout the handling of the crisis, a decision was not taken, direction was changed, and thus the worst of both worlds was accomplished. By not proceeding with the original idea of herd immunity, as Sweden did, it will never be clear whether it would have worked or not. By locking down late, the disease had already taken hold in some parts of the country. Many excuses are made for Johnson, such as that he would be a great prime minister when all is going well, but that is a little like saying that a man is the master of the road when he has a driverless car. Fighting for his party's leadership, and more particularly in the campaign for last December's election, he avoided scrutiny whenever possible. It was an election he was never going to lose. Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader, and Joe Swinson, the now departed Liberal leader, saw to that, which made his avoidance of, for example, an interview with Andrew Neil all the more cowardly. Had someone of Neil's interrogative abilities put Johnson through the ringer, might the lack of application that has shone through this crisis have been more apparent to the British public? Those who knew Johnson from his life as a journalist and as a mayor of London, who needed 8 deputy mayors to do his job adequately, knew he lacked attention to detail and had a modus vivendi of bluster and braggadocio designed to conceal the fact that he was lazy, selfish in the extreme, and capable of breathtaking lack of professionalism. Pretty savage stuff. In contradistinction to Boris Johnson, we have the First Minister from Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, who's apparently doing a fine job. I don't really think that's true, but we have a cult of personality around this woman. This is from the Times of London. An internal investigation has been launched after Scottish TV circulated a video of children praising Nicola Sturgeon for, quote, keeping them safe, unquote, during the coronavirus pandemic. The independent broadcaster posted the series of clips on Twitter yesterday before swiftly removing it after complaints and comparisons to coverage from totalitarian countries such as North Korea. The video features young boys and girls lauding the First Minister for her handling of the COVID-19 crisis. Apparently reading from a script, they say, quote, The children of Scotland would like to say thank you to Nicola, our First Minister. We are so grateful. Thank you for always keeping us safe, working so hard, being strong for this. Yes, totalitarian countries such as North Korea, also totalitarian countries such as Hitler's Germany and Stalin's Russia. There's a really shocking story that Toby Young reports on in Lockdown Skeptics today. And I've said several times on this live stream that it appears, at least to me, that the vast majority of people cannot understand numbers greater than 1,000. You get to 1,001 and it just all sense of proportion disappears. He begins. Professor Anthony Costello, the former World Health Organization director and now a member of the alternative SAGE, which is a body advising the British government about coronavirus, got very overexcited on Twitter earlier today in response to a Financial Times article showing the UK had the highest rate of deaths from the coronavirus pandemic among a group of 19 countries that produce comparable data. According to the article, the UK has registered 59,537 more deaths than usual this year since the week ending March 20th. In Costello's brain, this became, quote, the FT report the UK has the highest rate of excess COVID-19 deaths in the world, 59,537 more deaths than usual, with a rate of 891 deaths per million, unquote. Costello's tweet set off a chain of responses, each more hysterical than the last, with Robert West, a professor of health psychology at University College London, and a former member of a subgroup of SAGE, seemingly calling for a coup on the back of it. Quote, we cannot wait until this is, quote, all over to find out what is going wrong. But to learn from its mistakes, the government has to admit it is making them. This is something they appear completely unwilling to do. Time for the National Health Service and public health to take over, unquote. You know, there was a lot of talk in Britain in the late 1960s when Harold Wilson was prime minister, and then in the 1970s when Harold Wilson was prime minister, and later James Callaghan, there was talk of a military coup. And some of the people who were talking about it were not ridiculous people. You could talk of a military coup. It's clear that you have a breakdown, at the very least, of confidence in the government of the day, or even in the idea of British government itself. Toby Young writes, let's gloss over the fact that in Costello's fevered imagination, the highest excess death toll in 19 countries became the highest in the world, and focus on the other bit of hyperbole in his tweet. How did 59,537 excess deaths, which the FT says may have been directly or indirectly caused by the virus, become COVID-19 deaths? After all, according to the latest ONS data, 47,343 deaths in the UK have mentioned novel coronavirus on the death certificate, more than 10,000 fewer than the excess death toll. The $6 million question is whether all excess deaths since the week ending March 20th have been from COVID-19, or whether some have been due to the lockdown itself. As I pointed out yesterday, the number of deaths from COVID-19 in care homes in England and Wales in week 20, according to the ONS, is less than half the total number of excess deaths in care homes in week 20. In the graph below, I won't mention that. To be fair to Costello, the FT makes the same elision as him in the headline. Could it be that it's not undiagnosed COVID-19 that is responsible for those excess deaths, but the hysterical overreaction of the pandemic by the authorities preventing people with other diseases seeking medical help? The FT headline, UK suffers highest death rate from coronavirus. From that, it sounds like the FT is assuming all the excess deaths are due to COVID-19 as well. It doesn't try to justify this directly or point out the discrepancy between the number of excess deaths and the number of deaths in which novel coronavirus is mentioned on the death certificate. But it does say excess deaths is internationally recognized as the best way to compare a country's performance in handling infectious diseases. Chris Whitty, the UK's chief medical officer, calls excess deaths the key metric. Well, yes, they might be a good way of measuring how countries have handled infectious diseases, maybe even the key way. But it doesn't follow that, as the headline suggests, excess deaths are a reliable way of measuring how many people have died from coronavirus. And he says, I expected better from the Financial Times. He comments on Dr. John Lee's latest piece in The Spectator and points out that the way COVID deaths are being counted is incredibly unreliable. Dr. Lee writes, normally 2 doctors are needed to certify a death, one of whom has been treating the patient or who knows them and has seen them recently. That has changed. For COVID-19 only, the certification can be made by a single doctor, and there is no requirement for them to have examined or even met the patient. A video link consultation in the 4 weeks prior to death is now felt to be sufficient for death to be attributed to COVID-19. For deaths in care homes, the situation is even more extraordinary. Care home providers, most of whom are not medically trained, may make a statement to the effect that a patient has died of COVID-19. In the words of the Office for National Statistics, that's the ONS, this may or may not correspond to a medical diagnosis or test result or be reflected in the death certification. From March 29th, the numbers of COVID deaths have included all cases where COVID-19 was simply mentioned on the death certificate, irrespective of positive testing and whether or not it may have been incidental to or directly responsible for death. From April 29th, the numbers include the care home cases simply considered likely to be COVID-19. So at a time when accurate death statistics are more important than ever, the rules have been changed in ways that make them less reliable than ever. Dr. Lee concludes, one of the unappreciated tragedies of this epidemic so far is the huge lost opportunity to understand COVID-19 better. We like to beat ourselves up for having the worst COVID death toll in Europe, but we will never know because we decided not to count properly. In a country that has always prided itself on the quality of its facts and figures, the missing COVID-19 data is a national scandal. Oh, and he's got a pretty good joke here, sent to him by a reader. I was in Tesco today, and midway through my shop, I realized I'd forgotten something. I walked back to get it, much to the horror of the shoppers behind me. This is a one-way system, screamed one terrified lady. Didn't you see the arrows? Arrows, I said. I didn't even see the Indians. That's bumbling American worthy. He mentions Donald Trump's response to YouTube censorship, which I will be getting to. But YouTube has been censoring videos that misrepresent the facts as they see it. Toby Young writes, a few weeks ago, I took part in a discussion about the coronavirus crisis organized by the Institute of Arts and Ideas. The other participants were David Alexander, Professor of Risk and Disaster Reduction at University College London, Anne Johnson, Professor of Infectious Disease Epidemiology at University College London, and Michael Levitt, Professor of Structural Biology of Stanford and winner of the 2013 Nobel Prize for Chemistry. Among other things, we discussed the pros and cons of lockdowns, and I set out the case against, which is what I had been invited to do. Afterwards, I extracted a 4-minute clip featuring me and Michael Levitt, although he was nodding along enthusiastically to what I was saying rather than speaking, and put it on my YouTube channel, calling it the case against lockdowns. I also created a 2-minute clip and posted that on Twitter, which is still there. This morning, that would be yesterday morning at 12:20 a.m., I received an email from YouTube which said the following: Hi, Toby Young, just like the email I got. Hi, Kevin. Like, we're great pals. Sorry, I got some bad news for you. As you may know, our community guidelines describe which content we allow and don't allow on YouTube. Your video, The Case Against Lockdowns, was flagged for us for review. Upon review, we've determined that it violates our guidelines, and we've removed it from YouTube. Yes, the CEO of YouTube, Susan Wojcicki, told CNN in April the company would be removing information that is problematic, not false, problematic. And that included anything that is medically unsubstantiated. Okay, how about masks? Because that's not been substantiated. Because you have people on both sides of this, and they seem to be very vehement, saying masks work. No, there is no evidence that mask works. And besides, you should save the masks for medical professionals and those who work in care homes. I'll have more to say about YouTube and censorship in a short period of time. This is a very important story I'm going to talk about next, and it is a Canadian story, and I normally confine the Canadian stories to a ghetto near the end of the show, because I know there are a few Americans who are interested in Canada. But this is the first time that I have a world leader say these types of things. It's Jason Kenney, the Premier of Alberta, as I've mentioned before, and that's not a joke. Jason Kenney was once a friend of mine. I knew him quite well for several years before he got into politics. Well, directly. He was in an anti-tax movement. He ran an anti-tax movement before that. I have not been happy with Jason Kenney's career over the last 20 years because he's the cuck-servative's cuck-servative. Alberta has been, devastated by COVID-19 because it had already been devastated by the collapse in oil prices. There's a story by Don Braid in the Calgary Herald. In a legislature debate on the pandemic Wednesday, Kenney stressed that the disease has a low mortality rate among young people and a high rate for those over 80. Quote, the average age of death from COVID in Alberta is 83, and I'll remind the House that the average life expectancy in the province is 82. In Canada, 95% of fatalities from COVID are from those over the age of 60. 80% are in care facilities, and the risk of death from COVID for people under 65 is 0.006%. I'm going to repeat that last bit. The risk of death from COVID for people under 65 is 0.006%. Now, I suppose it's possible that social media could start scrubbing Jason Kenney's contents, but he is the Premier of Alberta, and he is quoting government statistics, including the shocking one that 80% of Canada's deaths from COVID-19 are in care homes, and which suggests shocking negligence at best. Kenney continued, what we are learning is that younger people, although not completely immune, have a rate of mortality related to COVID that is no higher than their general mortality rate from other illnesses. For most Albertans, the risk of death is from other pathogens, accidents, and traffic facilities is actually higher than it is for COVID. He continued, we cannot continue indefinitely to impair the social and economic as well as the mental health and physiological health of the broader population for potentially a year for an influenza that does not generally threaten life, apart from the most elderly, the most immunocompromised, and those with core morbidities. And now you see he's compared COVID-19 to influenza, which is definitely problematic. But I would encourage people listening to this, if their opinion on COVID-19, that's to say the response to it, is the same as mine, to quote these statements by Jason Kenney. And I'm really delighted to see that my old friend Jason is, as far as I can see, the first major politician in North America who has actually pointed out the real scale of the problem here. Old people, very old people, were not protected, and thousands of them died. This is a tremendous scandal, but young people were never at risk from it. And I suppose, if Google has a problem with that, then they can take it up with the Premier of Alberta. There's a long piece at Off Guardian by Rosemary Frey, were conditions for high death rates at care homes created on purpose. This is obviously a highly controversial story. The argument that she's making is that the decisions that were made, all sorts of decisions, led to a situation where many thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, died in care homes. I'll read a little bit from this. As I say, it's very long indeed, so I can't go into too much detail. Bureaucrats develop extremely broad definitions of novel coronavirus infections and outbreaks. This is coupled with the continuing presence in a number of care homes scattered across each jurisdiction of at least one nurse or physician who follows every letter of all definitions and rules. 2, influential organizations and individuals produce hospital care rationing guidelines that recommend younger people receive higher priority than the elderly during the pandemic by giving significant weight to how many years of life patients would have had ahead of them if treatment is successful. Also, some guidelines bar care home residents from being transferred to hospital. 3, the chief coroner and leaders of the funeral, cremation, and burial industries craft procedures that fundamentally change the ways care home deaths are documented and bodies dealt with. Their stated goal is to prevent overburdening of medical staff and body storage areas during a surge in COVID-19 deaths. They also put them into effect very quickly with no notice to the public. This gives those directly affected very limited opportunity for input and pushback. Among the many radical changes is death certificates are no longer completed by people who care for care home residents. Instead, they are filled in by the chief coroner's office. Also, examination of the undisturbed death scene is prevented, as are all but a very few postmortems and other sober second looks at the cause and mode of death. In the background are the complicit ranks of public health organizations, politicians, media, and many other influential individuals. When the pandemic first strikes, they focus on how new, dangerous, and poorly understood the virus is. As one side effect, this scares many care home staff so much that they flee in fear, leaving their overwhelmed colleagues to cope. Again, yes, how new, dangerous, and poorly understood the virus is. Well, the lockdown people are, as I predicted months ago, are patting themselves on the back for a job well done. But now we're beginning to see some doubt creep in that, don't blame us. The data was crummy, and incomplete. Well, the data was crummy and incomplete. Why were you making momentous policy decisions based on that? And it goes into considerable detail about the scandal in the Canadian province of Ontario, Canada's largest, most populous province, that decisions were made to stick infected people in care homes based on a belief that hospitals were going to be overwhelmed, and hospitals came nowhere near to being overwhelmed. And broader and broader definitions of what constituted an epidemic. One person with one symptom was sufficient for this to be considered an epidemic in a care home. Bullying children into agreeing to do not resuscitate orders. And this is perhaps the most particularly shocking thing in this piece is euthanasia. But it would appear that a great many elderly patients, very elderly patients, have been deliberately killed using morphine. Now, it has been known for decades now that with a great many patients with, say, cancer, the level of morphine administered is so high that it is more likely that the patient died of morphine overdose than cancer itself. But the situation that we see in the care homes, and the author gives examples of this, is that I think that it's prima facie enough to suggest that this is the greatest mass euthanasia in modern medical history. What of Andrew Cuomo? Remember the Love Gov? Everyone thought he was so wonderful. This is from The Guardian, and when The Guardian turns against you and you're on the left, you're in trouble. Cuomo gave immunity to nursing home executives after big campaign donations. Critics say data proves New York's liability shield is linked to higher nursing home death rates among the pandemic. And of course, in New York, just as in New Jersey, the governors insisted that infected patients be kept with uninfected elderly, with the results that we now know. In 2018, he faced a spirited challenge in his bid to win New York's 2018 Democratic primary, but he got a last-minute boost. A powerful healthcare industry group suddenly poured more than $1 million into his campaign, the Greater New York Hospital Association. There is now a movement in New York to strip care homes of this immunity, because they would be looking at billions, hundreds of billions, trillions in dollars in liability from this. Oh, and I mentioned counting. On National File, Patrick Howley writes that Democrat Washington Governor Jay Inslee, whose daughter-in-law works for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, oversees a state government that is now admitted to counting gunshot deaths as coronavirus deaths in official numbers pertaining to the virus, which sparked a draconian lockdown in the state. Gunshot deaths. And this was the result of investigation by the Freedom Foundation. Inslee responded to this report as dangerous, disgusting, and malarkey. I see he has the same thesaurus as Joe Biden. I wonder if he referred to anyone as a lying, dog-faced pony soldier. Oh, fanning these conspiracy claims from the planet Pluto. Gunshot wounds. Freedom of information lawsuits and the like. You get a lot of information in the United States from that. But the mainstream media, not particularly interested. Anthony Fauci calls on Christians to forestall receiving communion to prevent virus spread. He has urged Christians, this is from Breitbart, to wear masks, practice social distancing, and forego singing and receiving communion during worship services to curb the spread of the coronavirus. He said he didn't think there was a safe way to go about it, and the practice should be abandoned until further notice. I think for the time being, you just got to forestall that. Limit the number of people so you don't have people in the pews right next to each other, and the faithful should absolutely wear masks. Here is the money graph. Fauci, who identifies as a Jesuit-educated Catholic who has distanced himself from, quote, the concept of organized churches and religions, unquote. Okay, so he's an apostate Catholic. He's an apostate Christian. Dr. Fauci does not believe in the efficacy of Holy Communion. So why should Catholics pay any attention to anything he has to say? Let's go back to the chat. Okay, Delacroix. Yes, Kevin, that's what the Irish caretaker government did. Isn't this guy, the gay Hindu, who was seen in Phoenix Park next to some shirtless guy? Perhaps they were talking about bird watching, and it turned out that he had violated the lockdown rules as well. Hence the Irish COVID regulations. DB Cooper says, I don't know why, but that Bidenism makes me laugh. It makes me laugh, too, because I'm going to be 65 years old in, 5 weeks? And I've never heard anyone in my life speak like that. As many people have said, it's rather like, Grandpa Simpson. We had an onion around our belt because that was the style at the time. We called bees nickels, etc., etc., etc. Delacroix says we have no legal government at the moment. Didn't Belgium go 2 years or more without a government? Okay. Tom Anderson, Dr. Fauci has been the voice of reason during this pandemic. Yes, when he suggested that people use Tinder and Grindr, because apparently, it can't be transmitted sexually, but normally there's very close contact between two people having sexual intercourse or other forms of sexual activity. When Senator Cruz made a good joke about this, that, yes, it's okay to have sex. And Cruz said, how is that possible from 6 feet away? Ready for Stacey Abrams, VP? On the one hand, I'm delighted by the suggestion because that woman is such a train wreck. She is a, she is a morbidly obese, closeted lesbian black woman who's very angry. And maybe she would just, like grab Biden by the hair and pretty much, those black demonstrators treated Bernie Sanders, where they took over the stage and he just stood there looking gormless. That would be fun. That would be fun. Let's look up a little higher here. Edward Richardson says the Minneapolis rioters upped it several notches and burned down a huge construction site, affordable house, HUD project. If this is their war on whites, this would be known unfriendly fire. Very little attention paid to that aspect of it. The mayor of Minneapolis, Mr. Frey, he believes in fourplexes. He doesn't believe in single-family homes. And so this has been what the keynote of his administration has been: affordable housing. And so there was this big development in Minneapolis, and the righteous protesters burned it to the ground. How about that? Le Comte de Brea says COVID could go down as the Great Deception. John S. Kevin does not have the number of subscribers to make that work just yet. No, I'm just slightly under 800, I believe. Okay, let's get back to it here. Breaking news. This is from the Daily Mail. Donald Trump says he would shut down Twitter if he could, as he signs executive order against anti-conservative bias on social media and claims it is a threat to freedom itself, but won't delete his account. Trump said if it was legal, he would shut down Twitter. He said he would delete his account in a heartbeat if it weren't for fake news. The Attorney General, Bill Barr, said legal provision was stretched way beyond its original intention. He said when firms curate their collection and engage in censoring content, become publishers and shouldn't be entitled to a legal threshold. Trump signed an order that could open up social media firms to an avalanche of lawsuits. He also lashed out at Twitter's head of integrity over tweets calling him a racist tangerine. The contentious spat with Twitter comes after U.S. coronavirus deaths crossed over 100,000. I noticed that Matt Drudge was clever enough not to, have a big blinking 100,000, because he had the count. He had a counter, and you could see that they were all, oh my God, 100,000. We can do it, folks. We can do it. Yes, we can. But then he managed to, dial it back a little when the official number actually did hit 100,000. So we've had all these black pillars since 2017 saying that Twitter is useless and he is not going to do anything about conservatives being continually censored or forced off social media. So turns out they're wrong. Now, the Communications Decency Act has a section, I believe it's section 230, which indemnifies the social media companies from libel and from criminal material and from intellectual property theft if they remove this. Now, they get this protection because they're simply distributors and not publishers. Now, Mark Zuckerberg has said that Facebook is a publisher. And in that case, how could he possibly have the protection of the Communications Decency Act? Trump said, he's a billionaire who amassed a branding and real estate empire before running for president. Well, thank you for that. I had no idea. He said a small handful of powerful social media monopolies controls a vast portion of all public and private communication in the United States, and we know what they are. We don't have to name them. We're going to give you a complete listing. They've had unchecked power to censor, restrict, edit, shape, hide, alter virtually any form of communication between private citizens or large public audiences. Trump brought up the 2016 elections as he tore into Twitter, a fact lawyers might try to flag if companies try to claim in court the action is politically motivated. Quote, we can't allow that to happen, especially when they go about doing what they're doing, because they're doing things incorrectly. They have points of view. And if we go by that, it's actually amazing that there was a success in 2016, but we can't let this continue to happen. It's very, very unfair. What they're doing is tantamount to monopoly, you can say. It's tantamount to taking over the airwaves. Can't let it happen. Otherwise, we're not going to have a democracy. We're not going to have anything to do with a republic. Outstanding. So let's see. Some comments on this. Zuckerberg. Now, Alex Berenson, who I've quoted many times on this live stream, has actually praised Twitter for allowing a great deal more freedom, certainly about COVID-19 skepticism, than Facebook. And Facebook has been relentless in removing messages that are problematic, shall we say. But here, Zuckerberg was interviewed on the TV show The Squawk Box on CNBC, and he said, I don't think that Facebook internet platforms should be arbiters of truth. We're different companies, but I think we've been pretty clear on what I think the right approach is, which I don't think Facebook or internet platforms in general should be arbiters of truth. I think that's kind of a dangerous line to get down to in terms of deciding what is true and what isn't. And I think political speech is one of the most sensitive parts in a democracy, and people should be able to see what politicians say. And there's a ton of scrutiny already. Political speech is the most scrutinized speech already by a lot of the media, and I think that will continue. Of course, we have lines. Because we don't want to be determining what is true and false doesn't mean that politicians can say whatever they want. And our policies are grounded in trying to give people as much of a voice as possible, while saying if you're going to harm people in specific ways, if you are going to do something that's going to cause violence, if you were saying that something is a cure to a disease that has been proven to a cure, but it's not, and that could lead people to either not seek another treatment or do something that could be harmful, we'll take that down no matter who says that. Well, ever since I got on Twitter in 2015, it's been made clear to me that hurting women's feelings is a form of harm. So this cri de coeur from Mark Zuckerberg is essentially hollow. There's no limit to the idea of harm now. Again, from Breitbart, in a recent series of tweets, Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey defended his recent decision to fact-check and place warnings on two of President Donald Trump's tweets. According to Dorsey, Twitter fact-checking the president does not make the company an arbiter of truth. Is he serious? Claiming that instead, the site was attempting to, quote, connect the dots of conflicting statements. I don't know. How about my opponent is a liar? No, I am not a liar. My opponent is a liar. How are you going to connect the dots there? How are you going to do that? It has been pointed out that the head of site integrity at Twitter is someone called Yoel Roth. And he talked about actual Nazis in the White House in January 2017. That would be concurrent with Trump's inauguration. And he has a long history of essentially screaming abuse at Trump. Racist tangerine, I believe, was one of the phrases that was used. But who guards the guardians? That's the question. Oh, this fellow who was at the Toronto Star. I've made fun of him for years now because he looks like he was in the cast of Glee. His name is Dale. Last name is Dale. And he's now a fact checker at CNN. And apparently he's caught Trump in, I'm not making this up, it's like 10,000, 20,000 lies. Well, what's a lie? And what's a truth? There's a whole discipline, historiography, and historiography and epistemology are devoted to these questions because they're difficult questions. I quoted Claude Coburn, the late English or rather Scottish journalist. He was a communist, but he did good work in the media, and he had some profound things to say. One is, never believe anything until it's been officially denied. And this one, quote, it is evident to any thinking person that there are no neutral facts waiting around to be picked up like pebbles on the beach. No, I'm sure that Trump has said things such as the economy is in better shape now than has ever been in American history. Americans are better off than they have ever been in history. And he's been fact checked. They said, no, this is wrong, wrong, wrong. Well, there's all sorts of interpretations of, whether the economy is in the best shape in history. There are some people who believe, I do not, but there are others who believe that you look at the equity markets. And, the number of the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate, of course, famously does not include people who have stopped looking for work. And before coronavirus, that was around 95 million, somewhere between 90 and 95 million Americans. But there's all sorts of room for interpretation there. Trump is somewhat prone to hyperbole, that to say that there were, 1,000 people doing something, and it turns out it was only 850. Yes, a shocking, shocking untruth. This is from The Verge. YouTube is automatically deleting comments that contain certain Chinese language phrases related to the criticism of the country's ruling Communist Party. The company confirmed to The Verge that this was happening in error and that it is working to fix the issue. Quote, upon review by our teams, we have confirmed that this was an error in our enforcement systems and we're working to fix it as quickly as possible, said a YouTube spokesperson. The company did not elaborate on how or why this error came to be, but said it was not the result of any change in its moderation policy. But if the deletions are the result of a simple mistake, then it's one that's gone unnoticed for 6 months. The Verge found evidence that comments were being deleted as early as October 2019, when the issue was raised on YouTube's official help pages, and multiple users confirmed that they experienced the same problem. Comments left under videos or in live streams that contain the words in Chinese, Communist Bandit, or again in Chinese, 50-cent Party, are automatically deleted in around 15 seconds, though their English language translations and Romanized pinyin equivalents are not. The term Communist Bandit is an insult that dates back to China's nationalist government, whereas 50% Party, or Wu Mao, is a derogatory slang term for internet users paid to direct online discussion away from criticism of the CCP. The name comes from claims that such commenters are paid 50 Chinese cents per post. Yeah, it was just a mistake that was going on. Well, I think we've come to a crossroads with regard to not just social media, but media of all kinds. That you're going to have the media companies that are going to be sucking up to China. And this is unacceptable, and I believe it is going to be found to be unacceptable because there are very strict limits on media content that can be produced. And we have now been, for some years, censoring ourselves or being censored in order to protect the delicate sensibilities and amour propre of a brutal dictatorship. So let's take a look at Canada. And as I mentioned earlier, at least where I live, things are going back to normal, although the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, who is described as an extreme right-winger, has decided to extend the lockdown yet again. I keep hearing of, the second outbreak. They're speaking of the second outbreak as if it is in fact a fact, that it's on the calendar. It's going to happen. Well, they have no idea that this is going to happen. But I think that these governors and premiers who are continuing the lockdown, they're thinking, maybe another week. We'll see whether we get a second outbreak. But remember when we were hearing 2 more weeks around the time of Easter Sunday? Just 2 more weeks. And that was that, 7 weeks ago? 8 weeks ago? Something like that. So there seems to be no end to that. Canada, 88,501 confirmed cases, 6,877 deaths. The military has got involved with our care homes. Incredibly shocking scenes were found at care homes. in Ontario and Quebec. And the death rate in those two provinces, well, British Columbia, 164 deaths. Ontario, 2,189. Quebec, 4,302. Just absolutely shocking disparities there. That clearly nursing home conditions in Ontario and Quebec are abysmal. But governments have saved a lot of money. Governments have spent a lot of money. First, they destroyed the economy and decided that all this money was going to be created or borrowed in order to attempt to deal with the effects of this. But old people, particularly very old people, cost governments a fortune in pensions, medical costs, and care costs. I mean, just putting a roof over their head. And now across North America, a considerable proportion of those people have been dealt with permanently. Let's see the latest here from my part of the world. 2 more residents of long-term care homes have died from COVID-19 in BC, bringing the death total to 164. Provincial Health Officer Dr. Bonnie Henry and Health Minister Adrian Dix announced the 2 deaths, as well as a new outbreak at another long-term care home in the Fraser Health region at their briefing on the virus Thursday. You see, difficulty here is the lag in reporting time. My father was diagnosed with COVID-19. He died about 2 or 3 weeks later on May the 5th. It could be that his death has only been reported now, and he died in a long-term care home in the Fraser Health region. Oh, I'm looking at the actual name of this place, and it turns out that it's not the care home that my father died in. But Bonnie Henry, I guess she's going to start disappearing from our lives. I wonder how long the murals, heroic murals of her, will remain up around Victoria. Actually, I'm not making this up. The Premier of Ontario says he's done taking bullets for union members who wouldn't inspect care homes. We have union members who wouldn't inspect care homes. We have employees at care homes who simply fled in terror from their job. We have teachers who are threatening to refuse to return to work. Trudeau allies call for global unity at UN summit on pandemic recovery. Yeah, I don't think we're gonna have much global unity. What with China seem to be at war with the rest of the world. This is from The Conversation, and we need inquiries into why coronavirus is ravaging long-term care homes. Ontario says it will establish a commission to study the handling of COVID-19 in the province's long-term care sector. As I say, to repeat, Jason Kenney pointed out, approximately 80% of all of the COVID-19 deaths in Canada have been in long-term care homes. As to why the numbers in Canada are significantly lower than they are in the United States, I would suggest, 3 reasons for this here. One, that of course population density is much lower in Canada than it is in the United States. Second, the Canadian population is, as a rule, healthier than the American population. And 3, as far as I've been able to tell, the death stats are not being juiced in Canada. I just, they can have all the reviews they want. The tradition in Canada is that no one ever gets punished for things like this. To give the most famous example, the Canadian Red Cross deliberately distributed HIV-infected blood to people in Canada during the 1980s. This despite the fact that it had supplies of blood which were known to be uncontaminated. But it thought to save money, it was going to distribute the HIV-infected blood first. People in France were put on trial for this, but no such thing happened in Canada. The worst was that the Canadian Red Cross was stripped of the right to collect and distribute blood. There are many such scandals in Canadian history, but mine is a country where, does it really matter who's responsible? Forgive and forget, etc., etc. Forgive and forget everybody, but not white people, though. I've mentioned this woman previously. Her name is Sreeja Pratt. She is from India, a high caste Indian. She appears in public wearing a caste mark. And she left India. She was educated to university graduation. Then she worked in Singapore for several years, and then she came to Toronto, Canada. And she is now described as a race and gender columnist. She was originally hired by the Toronto Star to provide news for Canada's Desi population, Hindus in Canada. But now she's the race and gender columnist, and my word, she does not like Canada, especially white people. I mean, white people are just the worst. She had a column on Sunday. Mostly white COVIDiots at Trinity Bellwoods Park think the rules don't apply to them. They're right. One look at images of Trinity Bellwoods Park on Saturday, and it was instantly clear that idiocy is not just an affliction of the American middle class. Why? I wonder why she specifies middle class, because we were talking a couple of weeks ago about Lori Lightfoot, the frightening mayor of Chicago, who appeared to speak to her own people who were out in the streets violating the social distancing. And she told them to go home, and they rather gratifyingly told her to go home. So I don't know why she picks on the middle class. Because everyone hates the middle class now? She says that it's bothersome that while people around the world and even in our own city have been weathering the pandemic in far tougher conditions, in crappy apartments and crowded homes and in poverty, it was in Trinity Bellwoods that people somehow collectively felt entitled to say to hell with the social distancing. Their pleasure trumped our collective safety. Trinity Bellwoods is considered a gentrifying neighborhood with a higher concentration of white folks. Boo! Compared to the city. Like in all of the city, nearly half the residents are renters, and the same proportion have a bachelor's degree or higher, according to the 2016 census. When you have nearly half the population of a district being renters, then your average income is not going to be all that high. Last time I lived in Vancouver, I lived in the Kerrisdale district, and I tell people I had moved to Kerrisdale. Ooh, Kerrisdale, swanky. And I says, look, it's mostly apartments here, okay? It's not mostly people owning their own houses. And it turns out the average income in Kerrisdale is roughly the Canadian average. Sreeja Pratt writes, I wonder if the news about who is most at risk from COVID-19, the racialized have-nots, again, these black people who are proud to be black, but they weren't black until we racialized them, or would they come to terms with being racialized and are proud of being black? Anyway, the racialized have-nots have created a sense of inoculation among the haves. It's affecting those people, not us, unless we're old. Pandemics have always killed the poorest, mainly because those are the bodies the virus comes across. Wrong, wrong, wrong. The people who are dying in these care homes are not the poorest people. Not at all the poorest people. You don't get to live to be, 87 years old if you're poor, for all sorts of reasons. But this woman is not very good at logic or history. Photographs doing the rounds on social media show thousands of what look like white people, boo, milling around crowds in the West End Park as if millions of other Torontonians were not holding back from precisely that, because common sense and courtesy and safety. No doubt there were racialized folks among those gathered, fools come from all races, but they were protected by the overwhelming whiteness of those around them. Had that been a sea of black and brown folks, we'd be having a very different conversation today. Judging by that incident in Chicago I was just telling you about, I don't really think that the police are in any hurry individually, or certainly not their leadership, to sick the police on a bunch of black and brown bodies, ordering them to go home, to stop, to get up from being on the grass or whatever. Many, many pictures that I have seen from the Daily Mail would seem to suggest to me that the actual situation is the reverse of what Parad Carr is saying. Oh, and she gives a couple of examples here. Oh, Ramadan. Okay. But again, the question, I'd like to ask this woman is, did you not know that Canada was a white country before you moved here? And if you did know that Canada was a white country, why did you move here, given that you really hate white people? And given that this woman has written again and again in the Toronto Star that Canada's history is just abominable right from the very beginning. It's a horrible place that has done horrible things, well, to, wait for it, racialized people. Because apparently we racialized the Native Indians. They had not been previously racialized, even though they were members of tribes, actual tribes. I'm going to have a last look at the chat, and then we are done for the day. How are you liking the new hotel? Well, I'm sharing this suite with other people. And again, I suppose it's the uncertainty. I got, I ended up staying in that previous hotel, which was very nice. I mean, you all saw what it looked like. For what, 6 or 7 weeks? And again, I guess it's a false sense of security. But, now it's clear more permanent quarters are going to have to be found really quite quickly. Okay, and final comments. It's the white man's fault they can't pay their water bill. Well, that's a complaint in Detroit. Is it not? Riots are typically associated, not revolutions, but rebellions typically associated with, rising expectations. Truly oppressed people they don't lash out because they think the situation is hopeless. I don't know politically the effect of these riots that we're seeing in the United States. They really believe that we're on the cusp of the day when the black people or the police are going to be exiled from the inner cities, or when black people will have a permanent get out of jail free card, and not even a get out of jail free card, a get out of prosecution free card. Do they really believe that's so? Or is there some sort of sense that this is going to stop Donald Trump from being reelected? Because I think that would be very foolish reasoning. I don't know. I'm just going to stick with my original conclusion that people riot because it's fun. Also, you get free stuff. Now, it's a long time from the days when the cops weighed in there with the nightsticks and cracked skulls. We saw that at Ferguson. We see this all the time now, where you have these people, black people and white people as well, typically white women. They go up to police officers and they're this far away and they're screaming obscenities into their faces. And I really have to commend the patience of these policemen. I mean, it's obviously a very foolish thing to do, but they think that the police aren't going to do anything. And based on recent evidence in the Twin Cities, it has been determined that they are not going to do anything, just like they did nothing in Baltimore and did nothing in Ferguson, Missouri. But, of course, it's odd to me. We have so much talk from black people themselves of a return to segregation, because apparently it's literally killing in all sorts of ways to live with white people. And of course, this is the very opposite of the impetus that dominated in the 50s, 60s, 70s, etc. But I don't really believe that it's been thought through what the results would be for Black people if there was a return to segregation. I believe it would be rather like the Amsterdam sequences in The Wire. Well, that's it for today. Thank you all for listening and or watching. I'll be back on the air tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific time and 7 p.m. Eastern time. If you like the show or any part of it, I would appreciate it if you click on the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have not done so already. If you'd like to support the show, and golly, I would be so grateful if you did, especially now, my PayPal address is kevin_grace@hotmail.com. I'll see you all tomorrow, and I will leave you with my traditional benediction and farewell, that in these times of total social atomization, I do dearly hope that you, my dear listeners, manage to find a genuine form of human contact. Good night.